What if I told you that some of Europe's biggest problems today, soaring energy costs, economic decline, and even the Russia-Ukraine war might not have happened if Europe wasn't so tied to the United States? Sounds crazy, right? But think about it, is America truly Europe's greatest ally, or is it a burden disguised as a friend? For decades, Europe has relied on the US for security, economic stability, and global influence. But at what cost? From NATO's military expansion dragging Europe into conflicts to economic policies that benefit the US while leaving European nations struggling. Has this alliance actually made things worse? You're watching Elite Global Watch, where we simplify the complex and reveal the hidden. In this video, we're breaking down Europe's dependence on the US, how it's helped, how it's hurt, and whether Europe can or should finally break free. Because here's the big question: does Europe really need America? Or is it time to stand on its own? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you might see Europe's future in a completely different way. The US-EU relationship, a quick history. To understand why Europe depends so much on the US today, we have to rewind to a time when the continent was in ruins. World War II had left European cities shattered, economies collapsed, and nations desperate for a way forward. That's when the United States stepped in, not just as a liberator, but as Europe's new protector. The Marshall Plan, America buys influence. America's $13 billion rescue package, aimed at rebuilding Europe's economy. On the surface, it was about aid, but in reality, it was a strategic move. The US wasn't just helping, it was buying loyalty, making sure Western Europe didn't fall under Soviet influence. With the Soviet Union looming in the east, Washington pushed for even more control, and in 1949, NATO was born, a military alliance where, let's be honest, the US called the shots. The message was clear: Europe's security was now America's responsibility, and in return, Europe had to align with US interests. The Cold War, America's military footprint in Europe. The Cold War only deepened this dependence. The US stationed tens of thousands of troops across Europe, building military bases that remain to this day. Washington framed it as protection from the Soviet threat, but let's be real. This also ensured Europe would never act independently when it came to defense. Decades later, long after the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO kept expanding, closer and closer to Russia, largely at America's insistence. And what did that lead to? Rising tensions, eventually fueling the conflict we see today in Ukraine. Economic ties, the dollar's grip on Europe. But the US didn't just control Europe's security, it also locked Europe into its economic system. After World War II, the US dollar became the world's dominant currency, and Europe followed suit. To this day, major European economies depend on the dollar for global trade, oil purchases, and even financial stability. And when Washington imposes sanctions on Russia, Iran, or China, Europe often has no choice but to follow, even if it hurts European businesses more than American ones. So, what did Europe get in return? In exchange for military protection and economic ties, Europe gained stability, at least for a while. But was it really a fair deal? Because today, we see the cracks. Wars that Europe never wanted, economic policies that favor the US, and a continent that struggles to make independent decisions. So that brings us to the real question: has Europe outgrown its need for America? Or is breaking free even possible? Let's take a closer look at the hidden costs of this dependence. The cost of US dependence. For decades, Europe has relied on the United States for protection, economic stability, and political influence. But has this alliance come at a cost? From military entanglements to economic struggles and political control, let's break down the hidden price Europe pays for staying under America's wing. Military dependence and wars. Who really benefits? Let's start with NATO, an alliance originally created to protect Europe. But here's the tricky part: NATO has always been controlled by the US. And the question is, does it truly serve European interests, or is it just a tool for Washington's global strategy? NATO's role. More about US interests than Europe's? NATO has expanded eastward for years, despite warnings that this would provoke Russia. But who pushed for that expansion? The US. European leaders like France's Emmanuel Macron even called NATO brain-dead, suggesting that it no longer serves Europe's true security needs. The Russia-Ukraine war. Would it have happened without the US? Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room: Ukraine. Would this war have even started if the US wasn't involved? Washington encouraged NATO expansion towards Russia's borders, armed Ukraine long before the war, and rejected multiple diplomatic efforts that could have prevented this conflict. And now, who's paying the price? Europe. While the US is sending weapons and cash, Europe is dealing with the real consequences: millions of refugees, an energy crisis, and economic downturns. And let's not forget, American defense contractors are the biggest winners, making billions from this war. The economic burden on Europe's military spending. And it doesn't stop there. The US constantly pressures Europe to increase its military spending. NATO members are now expected to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, money that could have gone to healthcare, education, or infrastructure. Who benefits? American weapons manufacturers. Who suffers? European taxpayers. Economic impact. America wins, Europe loses. Sanctions on Russia hurt Europe more than the US. After the Ukraine war began, the US pushed Europe to impose harsh sanctions on Russia. But here's the problem: Russia was a major trade partner for Europe, especially in energy. Cutting ties didn't hurt the US much, but it devastated European economies. Germany, Europe's economic powerhouse, relied on cheap Russian gas for its industries. Now energy prices have skyrocketed, businesses are shutting down, and European industries are struggling to compete. The energy crisis. Europe lost, the US profited. And guess who stepped in to sell energy to Europe? The United States. With Russian gas cut off, Europe had no choice but to buy expensive American liquefied natural gas, making energy costs even worse. What looked like sanctions on Russia ended up being a financial jackpot for US energy companies. US economic policies pulling European businesses away. And it's not just energy. US policies like the Inflation Reduction Act have made things even harder for Europe. This law gives massive subsidies to American businesses, luring European companies to relocate to the US for better incentives. The result? Europe loses jobs, investment, and innovation, while the US benefits. Political influence and loss of autonomy. Is the EU really independent? Europe may look like a powerful bloc, but in reality, Washington still calls the shots. From trade to foreign policy, EU leaders often follow US directives, even when it hurts their own people. US pressure on Europe's China relations. Take China, for example. The EU has strong trade ties with Beijing, but Washington constantly pressures Europe to decouple from China, pushing for restrictions and trade barriers that hurt European businesses. Meanwhile, the US continues to trade with China when it suits its own interests. Spying on European leaders, friends or masters. And if you think the US treats Europe as an equal partner, think again. Remember the NSA scandal? It was revealed that the US was spying on European leaders, including Germany's Angela Merkel. So much for trust among allies. Who's really paying the price? At the end of the day, it's the European people who bear the cost of this dependence: higher military spending, economic struggles, and a lack of true political independence. So I ask, can Europe afford to keep following America's lead? Or is it time to break free and chart its own course? What if Europe went its own way? Imagine a world where European nations no longer answer to Washington. A world where they make their own military decisions, control their own economies, and shape their own future without interference from the US. Sounds impossible? Maybe not. Let's explore what Europe could achieve if it finally broke free from American influence. Can Europe defend itself without the US? For decades, Washington has pushed the idea that without the US, Europe would be defenseless. But is that really true? The reality of European military strength. Here's what they don't tell you. The European Union, collectively, already spends over $300 billion on defense, more than Russia and second only to the US. France has nuclear weapons, Germany is one of the world's largest arms manufacturers, and European nations have some of the most advanced fighter jets, tanks, and warships. Europe isn't weak, it's just been conditioned to rely on the US. If EU nations coordinated their forces, invested in their own defense industry, and developed an independent military strategy, they could easily stand on their own, ending US military presence in Europe. But to do that, one thing has to change: US military presence. America still has over 100 military bases across Europe, effectively controlling strategic locations. If Europe truly wants independence, these bases would need to go. Without American troops on European soil, NATO would either need a total transformation or Europe would finally have to build its own security alliance. Economic alternatives. Breaking free from the dollar. Could BRICS be an option? One of Europe's biggest weaknesses is its dependence on the US dollar. The US controls global finance through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, forcing European nations to follow American-led sanctions and financial restrictions. But there's an alternative. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is pushing for a new financial system that bypasses the dollar. Several European countries, including France, have already started exploring trade deals in alternative currencies. Could this be the beginning of an independent European financial future? Energy independence. Moving beyond US forced policies. One of the biggest economic disasters for Europe was losing cheap Russian gas. The US pressured the EU into sanctions, forcing European nations to buy expensive American LNG instead. But what if Europe took back control? With investments in renewable energy, nuclear power, and new trade routes, Europe could eliminate dependence on US energy policies and start making decisions based on its own interests. Stronger EU integration. A real European power? For Europe to be truly independent, it needs stronger internal unity. Right now, the EU is divided, economically, militarily, and politically. But what if European nations pooled their resources into a single defense strategy, a coordinated industrial policy, and a unified foreign policy? That would create a Europe capable of standing on equal footing with the US, China, and Russia. A multipolar world. Europe as an independent power. Right now, the world is shifting from a US-dominated unipolar system to a multipolar one, where power is more balanced between different regions. Europe has a choice: stay under America's shadow, or take its place as an independent force on the global stage. Imagine an independent Europe that makes its own military decisions, trades with whoever benefits its economy, sets its own political priorities without American interference. This isn't just a fantasy, it's a real possibility. The question is, will Europe dare to take that step? In conclusion, so after everything we've uncovered, one thing is clear: Europe's dependence on the United States is a double-edged sword. US benefits versus costs for Europe. What Europe gains: military security through NATO, economic ties with the world's largest economy, political influence as a close US ally. What Europe loses: military autonomy, forced into US-led conflicts, economic setbacks from US-driven sanctions and policies, political sovereignty, with Washington shaping European decisions. Whether it's war, energy, or trade, the price Europe pays for this alliance keeps getting higher. But here's the big question: is it too late to break free? Could Europe survive without America? Could it build its own military, strengthen its economy, and become a truly independent global power? Or has it become too entangled in the US-led system to ever escape? In a world shifting toward multiple centers of power, will Europe continue to follow Washington, or is now the time to reclaim its own path? What do you think? Now, I want to hear from you. Should Europe cut ties with the US and build a future on its own terms, or is staying aligned with Washington the safest option? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on the biggest global issues shaping our world.